Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay. So that was quite a hard act to follow, but I'll try my best. I'm. Thank you. Yeah, I'm very excited to be here in Florence. It's my first time in the city. And I'm also incredibly excited to be here at Pragma as well. So thank you very much for having me and coming to see my talk. I know that Marin has a fantastic talk about the App Store apocalypse going on in the next room. So if you did want to go and see that, then go, leave. It's fine, I won't be offended. Anyway, my name is Christopher Downer. I'm CJ Downer on Twitter. And I am a designer. I've been working on Mac and iOS apps for about 6 years. And for the past 2.5, I've been working on this app, Sketch, which some of you may already know. If you don't, it's a vector design tool for the Mac, and it's used for creating icons, interfaces, websites, wireframes, really anything that ends up on a screen. And if that sounds like your type of thing or something that would interest you, go and check it out. I'll post a link at the end of this talk. So, being a designer, I'm constantly seeing articles on Medium or people linking to blog posts and posting things on Twitter telling me that as a designer I need to learn how to code, or that I need to learn how to develop applications and so on. And I've read a few of these articles, and there's definitely valid points in there. Designers should absolutely be more familiar with the design process and have an understanding of how things work. And that's a good thing, because it will help out the developers that they work with. But I'm going to let you into a bit of a secret. I can't code. And I want to know how to code, and I've tried to learn so many different times, so many methods and ways. I tried to learn when I was at university, sitting down one-on-one with a developer, looking at books, online courses, you name it, and in a variety of different languages as well. I started off, I think, looking at JavaScript, and before moving on to Python, thinking that would be a bit easier. And even developing natively in Objective-C, and most recently I had to look at Swift. But when it comes down to it, developers are super smart and clever people. And as for myself, on the other hand, not really. I mean, I know what a function is, and I can just about grasp the concept of a loop, but I don't know what a pragma is. Someone please tell me. But I've not given up just yet, and I will still keep trying. Related to that, though, a topic that I don't often see very many people mention at all is, or ask, should developers design? And that's kind of what inspired this talk. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that you need to go and design everything yourselves and ignore your designers. That's crazy. And although developers may not be pushing the pixels, they make decisions all the time that shape the outcome of a design. Now, strangely enough, I've probably learned more about design from developers than I've learned about design from designers. They've taught me a whole load of things and stuff that I would have never even considered when I was starting out, including things like accessibility and localization, managing color profiles, designing for multiple displays, placeholders, handling errors, security, first runs, edge cases. The list goes on and on. But before I found out about any of these things, I don't really think I was designing anything at all, just more of a case of making pixels look pretty. Aside from that kind of knowledge, it seems to me that nearly all the developers I've worked with are interested in visual and interaction design. which is really great. But a lot of them seem quite intimidated by it, and they don't really know how, or not too sure where to pick it up or how to begin. So I hope to use this talk to kind of dispel some of the myths surrounding design, talk about design in general, share some insights, get you to perhaps think more like a designer, and then hopefully in the end you'll be less dependent on the designers that you work with. So I'm going to start with the basics and answer the question, what is design? Now, you obviously all know what design is, and this might seem obvious, but I'm going to say design and UI design a lot over the course of this talk. So let's see what I mean by that. So we have UI design and UX design. Those are the two common terms that you know, right? UI is the visual stuff, and the UX is the interaction. So what about that sweet spot in the middle? Is that design? Well, yes. A lot of people treat UI and UX as two different disciplines, but to me, they're harmonious. I can't just go away and design the visual side of things without thinking how it affects the usability and the interaction. And although UI design as a term does refer to the visuals, it's also confusingly the term used to cover everything. So it's that I'll be referring to if I mention the UI or the UI design rather than just the visual side of things. Now, you obviously know what design is, but perhaps we can learn a bit more by looking at what design isn't. Well, first of all, design isn't some kind of scary, magical process. Designers don't just go away and come back with a completed design in about 5 minutes. There's so many considerations and matters that designers need to address, and there's so many problems to solve. Nor is design a phase that kind of runs along and ends and development begins. They, in fact, run alongside together in a number of stages. So if we look at this very, very rough timeline, we can see that both design and development do run alongside each other. Now, of course, developers do a whole lot more than just development things, but it's different for each project, just as it is for design. So your typical designer, they'll probably start by sketching something else on paper. Maybe other designers go and do the research stage first, but let's say they sketch out their ideas on paper before mocking it up in an app like Sketch, where they transfer what they have on paper onto the screen, creating more of a higher fidelity type of mock-up. And then the stage after that, which so many designers are doing nowadays, is the prototyping stage. And I know there's a great talk on prototyping coming up after this one, which will go into prototyping in a whole load of more detail. But designers will use apps like Framer or Origami to visualize how the app flows together and work out the interaction and the animations and so on. And then afterwards, they iterate on that design. They critique it, they review it, they just keep on refining it and making it better each time. So hopefully when it comes down to the implementation and testing side of things, that's it. But sometimes, as we know, that's not always the case. So a common misconception around designers is that they need to be artistic. People don't feel like they can go into start designing something because they can't draw a straight line, for example. But nobody is born a great designer, just like nobody is born a great artist, which means it's something that anyone can do, just like anybody can play a musical instrument in theory. And it's just something that you work at and get better over time with practice. And finally, design isn't just a matter of taste. For visual design, sure, of course. But when it comes down to interaction design, it's less subjective. There's rules to good design, and even more rules when it comes to user interface design, both written and unwritten. Now, just before I go over those rules, you may not be convinced why you need to know more about design. You all write code, and you're probably really awesome at it. And some of you may already work with a designer, but if you're an indie dev or a small company, you might not have a designer. They might only be available freelance a few hours a week, and they can be pretty expensive to have around all the time. But no matter where you work, a designer probably isn't going to be around all the time. They might be working on different projects, or just simply the developer to designer ratio is usually pretty high. So when you're developing and you come across an issue that needs a design solution, and the designer isn't around to ask or find out more about the problem, what do? Do you wait for them to come back? Do you queue up all the problems that you have and then run it by them when they're available? Well, most of the time you can't. Deadlines tend to be pretty tight, and you can't wait for them, so you need to make a decision there and now. So as a developer, you need to fill in the blanks. And this might come down to making a guess. And that might not be the best choice. Of course, you can have a lucky guess, but you certainly don't want to leave your design down to guesswork. So in that situation, when the designer's been away and they come back and they see the developers have designed without them, a lot of the time it upsets the designer. It means there's more work for them to do as they have to kind of undo the damage, which in turn means there's more work for the developers as they have to implement those changes and test them and so on. But as for designers, they probably don't have the time to consider all the nuances of an app or are aware of edge cases and things like that. And they're less familiar with the app as the developer is. So at times, they're less informed to make decisions. So what it comes down to, the more informed you are, the more time you'll save. And then hopefully you won't hear your designer telling you these things. Can you make the animation smoother? What does that even mean? Or move this 2 pixels to the left. Now, I'm sure if you all had a euro for every time you heard that, you could probably go and retire. All right, so let's look at some of those rules. As I mentioned, design is not a magical process, and it's not really a matter of taste. It's something that's driven by a lot of constraints and considerations. Now, a great place to start is with Apple's Human Interface Guidelines, and I'm sure most of you have probably seen this. If not, you can get it on iBooks, and it really is a great little guide. It covers a whole load of basics and principles, and it's something that I keep coming back to time and time again. But it is important to remember the name. They're the Human Interface Guidelines, not the Human Interface Rulebook. The guidelines are important to know, but not necessarily something that you have to follow. But the more experienced you are at designing, the easier it is to know when to move away from it. So consistency was something that was mentioned by Michael earlier. But when it comes to design, there's no silver bullet or magic trick to make what you design awesome. But the one small thing that does go a long way is consistency. Is the look or feel consistent within the OS? Or is the look of the app consistent between screens? Making sure you achieve consistency is almost like baking your own rules, and this can be done in the form of setting up style guides or layout grids. But often at times, it really is just as simple as asking yourself, is this the same color that I was using in my previous screen? Do these two elements share the same padding? Do these text boxes align with each other? Now, in order to create consistency, you need to train yourself to see consistency. Have the eye of a designer. Now, one thing you may have noticed with designers is that a common trait amongst them is that they're all quite fussy and meticulous. They really obsess over the small details, and they diagnose themselves as obsessive compulsives. Again, nobody is kind of born with this ability. It's just something that you pick up over time. And then suddenly you will notice, perhaps, in other apps, a row of icons, one icon might not quite line up with the others, or something is slightly off-center. And once you see those things, you cannot unsee them. It's a curse. It's really horrible. But when it comes down to your own products or your own designs, that's an invaluable skill to have. Okay, so the next rule is space is your friend. We all love space, but sadly it's not this type of space. I'm talking about white space. Now, some of you might know it as negative space. They both mean the same thing. But what is white space and why is it important? Well, let me show you. So you can't see that at all. But that's designed for an iPad app. It's quite rough and it's basic. But just imagine, if you could see it, that it was something designed by a developer in Storyboards and Xcode by someone who's not very design focused. And as well, hopefully I wanted you to see, you can see it's a standard looking interface and there's not really anything custom. And the UX seems pretty solid as well. But when I look at this design, I just think it looks quite messy. The content is hard to read and the elements are very close to each other. So what could we do to improve this? Or what would an improved version of this design look like? Well, how about this? By increasing the size of the white space around each of these elements, it makes it far easier to focus in on the content. It has room to breathe. Now, the increased margins and the aligned elements, and even the increased line height, they don't only make this look better, but it's more legible. The image here, for example, that my friend may have sent me, it pops right out to the edges of the view, so I can really appreciate it. But as you may have noticed between this screen and the previous one, is that there's less content on the screen. I can't read the entirety of the email anymore. But you could argue that is a good thing. The less you see, the more you can focus on. And people can only typically focus on one thing at any given time. And it's important to remember that scrolling on iOS is really nice. And everybody knows how to do it. So it's okay for your content to kind of go beyond the fold and off the edges of the screen just by moving elements around. Now, when you're thinking about design as a developer, it's very easy to think, I'm going to come up with the design solution which is the easiest for me to code. Now, that's completely understandable. In the way back when I was trying to put together a UI in Xcode, I couldn't implement what I had designed, so I did what I know and made it as simple as possible. But on the flip side, however, a lot of designers don't factor in these kind of limitations and will dream up these wacky things that are near impossible to implement. But for developers, the knowledge they have can really go some way into creating tangible designs that don't feel basic. A lot of the time, they'll also want to make something that looks and feels great. And I've worked with designers in the past who have proposed ideas to me that I would have never even thought was possible. But perhaps the most well-known example of a developer designing a completely new interaction is Pull to Refresh by Lauren Richter. I don't need to explain what Pull to Refresh is. You've all seen it. It's in virtually every single app that has a timeline or refreshable content, and it's even in iOS in the Mail application. Now, as for Lauren, he's kind of one of those magical unicorn people who they're not only an amazing developer, but they're also a really good designer as well. But his story was, at the time, he was developing a Twitter client called Tweety. And as you may remember, if you've been using Twitter clients for years and years, you'd have the refresh button in the top corner. You'd scroll up and then press refresh and see what tweets are new. But being a developer who's design focused, he saw that that kind of behavior and interaction really sucked. And he could see how Pull to Refresh might work. So he wrote it, shipped it, and as they say, the rest is history. But that's probably an interaction that I could guarantee no designer alone could think of, just because of the developer insight involved. Typical designer wouldn't know that you could trigger an event just by scrolling or swiping down on the screen. Now, if we go back to visuals, this one is perhaps a bit subjective. But the one thing that I see quite frequently, although less so nowadays, is that the colors used in designs made by developers are not very nice, to kind of put it lightly. But there's a really good reason for this, and that's because they are the system's VGA colors. So if a developer wants to use blue in their design, let's say they'll type in blue, or the RGB value 00255. It's quick and it's easy, and this is the color you get. But if you're not going to be working with a designer who you know will tweak this later on, or you're working on something that's going to ship, please just consider just taking the time. It won't even take 1 minute just to consider tweaking it just a little bit. Now, this isn't a blue that you would see anywhere. It's quite an unnatural color, only something that you'd see on a computer screen. And it's the same blue that you see in the blue screen of death if you've had the misfortune to use a Windows computer. But when it comes to colors, there's so many different options. For blue, for example, you could choose something a little less harsh, maybe slightly more green. Or even better, use the eyedropper from the color picker to pick a color from a photograph or an image. Now, the options when it comes to colors are endless, unless it's green. But just a simple and straightforward tweak like this can really go some way into improving how something looks. Now you can see a list of those, or maybe not, VGA colors here, and you'll be hard-pressed to find any of them used in a typical interface, with the exception of white, black, and possibly that red. But a lot of the time, text and other elements that appear black aren't actually 000 black, but they're more of a very dark gray. And one reason for this is because it simply reduces the harshness of contrast of the black text against a white background. And it's the same when it's reversed. If it's white text on a black background, the text is probably a very light gray, and the black is dark gray. in saying that and going over some stuff about visuals, how it works will always trump how an application looks. It's simple. An app with a great experience and a native interface will be a way better design, although perhaps not visually, than an app with a crappy UX and a really pretty custom UI with flashy animations and so on. But that's not to say the aesthetics aren't important, but everything should look like a stock application. That would be really horrible, and I wouldn't want to use any apps. But consider all the pros and cons involved with going down that route. Is it a better solution, first of all? Can it still be made accessible? Is it intuitive? Will people know how to use it if they pick it up? And related to that, be boring. You're all probably thinking, why is a developer telling me to make my designs look boring? But honestly, a lot of the time, the best solution is often the boring one. Is the best one. Obvious design will be clever design every single time. And it definitely is kind of one of those times where you might have to compromise on the visual side of things just to make it more usable. But in the end, it will be worth it. And it's more of a challenge to design around these types of constraints. Often I'll design something that I'm really happy with and think looks pretty, but I've forgotten to account for some cases or the feature may have involved. So I've got to add these things to my design whilst they'll be more usable and the feature will be better for it. My design now looks horrible because there's all these extra options and buttons in there. So I have to kind of still really try my best to make this look good, make sure everything's consistent and lines up neatly, maybe make elements contextual. And it's one of those challenges that as a designer I really love because it pushes me. It makes me work hard at trying to make something look good and still be usable. But boring designs, they're always far more practical and they can be made far more accessible. And whilst you're at it, ignore trends as well. Go to the front page of Dribble and then design the exact opposite. I mean, what are the two main trends right now? Big, bold animations and hamburger buttons. People are still designing those, right? But trends are temporary and they'll fade quickly. But strong foundations, on the other hand, they'll be more permanent. They'll last way longer and your app won't look outdated in 3 months' time. And the design will be better for it. Now, the last rule that I recommend taking on board is just question everything. Be self-critical and ask yourself, is this good enough? It's quite easy to criticize other people's work, but it's a lot harder when it comes down to your own. You have to question every element that you add. Does it have a place? Does it benefit the screen? You have to keep in mind that less is more. And for usability, I like to simply ask myself, well, if I designed this app and gave it to my parents, would they know how to use it? There's certainly not pro users, they have iPhones, but that's about it. But if they would know how to use the app, then to me that's a sign that the design is probably quite good and quite safe. But if you had to teach them how to use it, then that's bad. You can't teach everybody who downloads your app how to use it personally. So you need to go back to the drawing board. But with that, you might know how something works because we're all developers and designers and we're geeks, but we can't say the same for the average Joe who's going to download the app in a wider audience. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. Now, with that, you're probably wondering, okay, that's all good, but what is the secret to good design? As I mentioned earlier, there is no magic trick or silver bullet or one weird thing that doctors hate. But the secret, really, quite simply, to good design is iteration. And that's something I mentioned a little bit earlier. So you make something and you keep improving it and improving it and improving it until it's as good as possible. Now, as developers, that's understandably going to be quite a hard thing to achieve because your time is already limited enough as it is. But when I was a younger designer, I always thought that my best idea was my first idea. My first idea wasn't just something that I would throw out there and not think about anything else. It's something that I kept going over in my mind, working out all the pros and cons, how something might look, how it might work, kind of really going over it in my head and getting very attached to this idea. And then I would go and mock it up. But by doing that and not kind of sharing my ideas, even the kind of most minor and insignificant ones, that could actually be the spark that ignites the idea in someone else's mind. So by sharing your ideas with other people and getting feedback on those, and then going back to the drawing board, that will undoubtedly improve your design. And iteration is the secret to success at so many of these kind of large companies and startups who are really renowned for their huge design cultures. Also, good design happens when there's an overlap between designers and developers. The earlier the developer gets involved with the design, the better. If they're included in design discussions, then they'll have more of a scope of what's going on. And when designers and developers work together, they'll gain empathy for each other's vocations. They'll appreciate the problems that they have to come across and what type of problems that they have to solve. But since iOS 7, I like to think that design is a lot less intimidating, especially for developers and people who may not be designers, but they want to go and tweak an icon or lay out something, mock something up. You don't need to be a Photoshop pro anymore to create realistic, glossy-looking toolbars with green felt backgrounds. You don't even need a copy of expensive Photoshop anymore to get into design. But with that, it's far less visual than it once was, and people now understand that how it works is more important than how something looks. But in the end, developers can really hone their craft because they have the time to do so. As we found out, iteration is really kind of key to good design. But if the developers they work with start upping their game and start learning more about design, that in turn is going to make designers raise the bar and really keep them on their toes and will encourage them to come out with better work. Now, although we like to joke and think that designers and developers are from two different planets, a lot of us are in this industry for the exact same reason, to ship great apps and products for real people, actual users all around the world. And it's something that we mustn't forget. But if there are any designers here today, what can you take away from this? Well, you need to lead rather than just going away and designing something. Perhaps involve developers more in design decisions. Explain why and how you came up with a solution rather than just handing them a spec sheet or all the assets. If you do usability testing, perhaps involve your developers in that. As I mentioned before, developers are super smart and they'll quickly be able to learn the differences between good and bad design. And it isn't just enough being a designer. As soon as you're away or busy, the design stops. But if you lead, the design can the developers continue with the design whilst you're not there, and their work will get better over time. So let's have a quick recap over some of these points I've made. At the beginning, I asked, should developers design? But they already do. Every day, they make decisions that shape the outcome of a design. Nor is design a phase that's parallel to development. As we saw, it doesn't just end and development begins. It's something that runs all the way through to the end of the project. Consistency is incredibly important. Visual consistency, as well as a consistent experience, whether that just be across your app or the wider product, or even in the operating system. And try not to design what's the easiest thing to code. This is very easy for me to say as someone who doesn't code what I design. I apologize. And I think I've angered a lot of developers in the past by coming up with ideas that perhaps aren't so simple to implement or trivial. But in the end, the developers are happy to put the extra work in because they know the product will be better for it. And 3 more points. Design obvious over clever. This will make the app far easier for people to use. It's going to make it more easily accessible. And by ignoring trends, you're going to increase the longevity of your design. Be your own worst critic. Question why you're adding something to a design and ask what benefit does it serve. And by questioning things, that will ultimately lead to a natural iteration as well. And again, to all the designers in the room, involve your developers in the process more. The earlier in the project you do that, the better. Developers will have a greater understanding behind design decisions, and they'll be able to learn from that rather than just being handed a finished mock-up or design to go and implement, and not have any kind of knowledge or understanding behind how the designer got there. Now, just before I wrap up, I'm going to leave you with this quote a friend of mine came up with, and he said that I could use. So, clean user interface is like clean code. It's organized, it's consistent, and it's as sparse as it can be, whilst still doing everything that's needed. Thank you. So, do we have any questions? Hi.
Hello, Chris. My name is Gregory, and I want to ask you more practical questions.
Sure.
As you may know, in Xcode 6, they've introduced the vector format images, which you can use for different scales and different type of iPhones and iPads. Do you use it in real life, or you prefer to draw images for specific resolutions? 1, 2, and 3x?
Yeah, saving PDFs out is something that, of course, I've been kind of wanting to do in Sketch, so the assets are using it, so the file size is smaller, and you don't have all these, 1x, 2x, and so on. I think that is a good thing to use PDFs and vector assets like that if you design them at 1x, so the kind of smallest size possible on non-Retina screens. And if it looks good there, then when it comes to Retina displays, that's simply doubling it, so you can guarantee it's going to look good there as well. Whilst it seems that a lot of designers nowadays kind of design at 2x, and they'll design, if you're thinking about pixels, they'll design in an odd number of pixels. So when that gets scaled down by half, we do see the blurry kind of lines and assets. But yeah, for saving PDFs, I absolutely do recommend it. Just be sure to design at the smallest possible resolution at 1x, and then if you scale up, talking about iOS 2, 3, it'll be fine.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. If no one else has any other questions, then feel free to come up to me. I'm going to be at the Sketch Lab later on, where I'll be showing you a little bit about Sketch for developers and showing off some cool plugins. And there you can come up and ask me all the questions you want. I'll be around all day enjoying the rest of the conference, so hopefully you'll enjoy it too. So thank you very much for coming here.